Adam Safron and Colin Deyoung, thank you very much for joining me again. This is actually our second chat together, and we've had one individually. This conversation is related to the other topics that we've had in a sense and kind of building on it around this question of the self. You'll hear a lot of people arguing these days, a la Sam Harris, sometimes from Buddhism, that there is no self or that the self is illusory, that the self is something we need to get over in order to wake up. And so it's kind of fake in a way that there isn't a self. That hasn't sat well with me. It kind of leads into a lot of arguments about there no free will as well, no causal reasoning or no somewhere, a starting point for control or a control hierarchy or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I struggle with this personally. I'm kind of scared of this topic, which is why I'm glad to have seasoned thinkers to help me through it, because it's very important. I think it's the basis of a lot of our thinking about ourselves, ironically. So yeah, without further ado, maybe what is the self? Maybe we'll go between either of you and you can kind of give a version of what you think it is.
All right. Well, shall I start?
Yeah.
I guess I will say a little bit about the way that psychology in general thinks about the self, and then also what I think is the most sensible way to think about it. So I still think actually that the way that William James discussed the self, 150 years ago or whatever, close to it at this point, is very useful. And partly because he distinguished between two different meanings of what we might be talking about when we talk about the self. And he called them the I and the me. And I'm going to start with the me because I think the me is actually the self that we are usually talking about, certainly in psychology today. And also when there are these debates about is the self illusory, I think what we're mostly talking about is the me self. And so as you can kind of get the hint from the grammatical difference between I and me is an object of observation. And so the me self is our model, our conscious model of what we are, what we're like. It is basically this model that we build of, this organism, this perspective, whatever you want to call it, whatever the thing is that we experience, that we attach some kind of coherence and agency to. Our model of that is the self. And so it's very important to remember that it is a model. And I think that that's actually what is being tapped into when people argue that the self is illusory. I do think that there's a real way in which the self is illusory. Because if you think that your model of who and what you are is an accurate reflection of reality, of everything that is who and what you are, then that's an illusion. You're wrong, because all of our models are partial and imperfect. And so you can get overly attached to your beliefs about who and what you are, and therefore not make room for everything that you don't know about yourself, or everything that you could become, or all of the underlying processes that go into generating your understanding of yourself, but are not that model, not that understanding. So, when I'm if to be charitable to the Buddhist perspective, I would say that the permanent self is illusory. The essential self is illusory. There isn't something that our model of ourselves picks out that is, permanently who we are, exactly how we are, all of that. But it's not illusory in another sense, which is that we build this model of ourselves. We do have an understanding of who and what we are. It can be more or less accurate, and it is essential to allowing us to reflect on ourselves, to correct course, to try to change ourselves in various ways, to either to accept how we are or to change how we are into something that we might be. All of this requires that kind of guiding model. And it's a basic principle of cybernetics, and we talked a lot about cybernetics in our last conversation, that in order to control something effectively, the optimal way to do that is to have some kind of a model of it. You have to have some representation, and here I don't mean like a computational representation necessarily, but just like at least some kind of physical model of the thing that you're trying to control in order to effectively control it as a control system, as a cybernetic system. Okay, so that's the me, basically. That's the model of ourselves. And then there's the I. And the I is that we have always an experience of ourselves as the center of our experience, right? Like there, and it gets tricky. And I was just talking to a friend about this last night, that so if the I is basically that kind of pure agent perspective, like I'm seeing, right? I have a perspective. I'm from a particular point in space. I model, this kind of field around me, and the location of that point that is where my perception comes from. That's part of this I, right? The thing that is the agent that is doing the modeling and doing the action. But as soon as we start talking about that, we are modeling it, right? And so as soon as you start to pay attention to the I, you are back into the me again. And one of the cool things that, the Buddhist tradition, among others, discovered is that it is possible to, through meditation practices, to come to a state where you're not constructing a model all the time, and where you are just in this state of sort of open presence, experiencing what is coming in through your senses, but without trying to create or hanging on to a model of who that thing is or what that thing is that is having that experience. And so I think, again, I think that the me is illusory in an important sense. The I is the one thing that essentially can't be an illusion, right? I think therefore I am, we could say probably a little bit more, I don't know, Buddhistically, like I experience, therefore I am. Although, of course, as soon as you take the I am, Buddhists are probably going to complain. But there is this sense at which some basic perspective and experience is the one thing that's undeniable. But if you manage to remove all of the sense of modeling of that, then what you get is just the sense that it is essentially just being, right? It is what is, because your experience is all it is until you make the assumption that there's something out there that's differentiated. And so I think that if you can manage to rid yourself of the me temporarily, and I do think that it probably should only be temporary if you want to be a functional human being in the world, but if you can manage to do that, say through meditation, then you also lose the sense that the I is a separate thing from anything else, because you've basically just taken yourself to the point of the pure perception as opposed to creating any kind of model of what is perceiving. So I'll leave it there.
Adam, any thoughts? It's a great place to jump in. Thank you very much, Colin.
Seems like having differentiated among multiple kinds of self is very important, and it does seem like two of the major ones, like the me and the I, that does seem to be like one of the major distinctions. I know some people go more like they'll keep going. For instance, like was it Nestler? I forget who it was, but it's like you can start talking about like the social self and get like more an autobiographical self or different, like,
yeah.
But those
are all, if I can just interrupt for 1 second, I think those are all facets of the me, right? It's like me as a social being, me as, any of those things are basically just zooming in on one part of that model that we have.
That seems right. And I guess one thing I'm wondering is like the relationship between like the I and the me. And these different, so like, for instance, like for consciousness, sometimes I'll think like the different ways people use the word consciousness with different degrees of complexity, and think of it either like something like a tree with like roots and a trunk and branches, or like Matryoshka dolls, where it's like different, there's like an inner, maybe like minimal embodied self, or like, and then you go outwards, and then like you're building up like more elaborate or abstract ones on top of that. So it seems like the I would be like, would precede the me as like a precondition for it, and relate in potentially interesting ways to notions of consciousness in terms of like having a something that's well, yeah, got to give the devil his due. Sam, talks about this, the question of how do you move from a third person to a first person ontology. Like, how do you have like a point of view on the world? And this is being like the core question of consciousness, but it's also, you're now getting at selfhood also in terms of the I. And I think like what you're saying about, the sense in which like the me must be in a way illusory because it's a model and all models are wrong. and and they have to be like that's their use, is this like reduced complexity description that you can leverage. And you have a map that can reflect the territory, and if the map is equivalent to the territory, it's not much good as a map. Like, it's like giving you this more economical representation for like explaining and predicting that you can leverage for being a more intelligent agent for achieving goals in the world. And so, and also like this sense in which the illusion like rhetoric always makes me somewhat uncomfortable in terms of like, if you just do like dead stop at illusion, you're like flirting potentially with nihilism, or like something that's almost like if you grant like the word illusion, it's almost like like there's like you can end up going like overly postmodern, or where it's like it applies to like all things and then applies to no thing.
Yeah, I think you also end up with a confused ontology, speaking of ontology, because you end up essentially wanting to deny that there are any distinctions that exist in the world. We're all one, everything's all one. That I think is sort of an intuition getting at the fact of that kind of basic phenomenological field. But you said going from a third person to a first person ontology. I think in an important sense, there's no such thing as a first person ontology. There's an epistemology, right? And I think a lot of people have confused epistemology and ontology. I think Heidegger confused epistemology and ontology, right? He thought he was studying being, but he was actually studying experience. He was studying the experience of being, you could say, right? Well, and like, the whole idea of Dasein kind of already encapsulates that, right? Like, what is it? It is being, their being is the way that Dasein literally translates. So being there. And that's what a human being is a being there. But the being and the, there-ness of a particular perspective are not identical. And I think that if you make that phenomenological reduction where you say, well, let's just, like, I can't prove that the world exists outside of my experience, so let's just pretend like it doesn't for a while and see where we get from pure phenomenology. That's like a first person ontology, but I wouldn't want to call it an ontology even, because I don't think we have ontology until we are willing to make the assumption that the world exists in differentiated form independently of our experience of it.
I think I'm glad you bring up like epistemological versus ontological claims, because it seems like, I guess, within maybe Buddhism, sometimes psychedelics, there's like two ways in which they oftentimes try to dissolve the self, with both, like, I'd say, potentially harmful and potentially salubrious aspects to it. Where like, so Colin was mentioning like the sense in which like if you overly reify the self, you can be stuck. You might not get it like the way that selves are, necessarily. They have to be confused in terms of like as models, like to be useful. They must be like they must in some sense miss the mark, even if they're. But also, it's important for like the impermanence is part of the power of a self as process in terms of its ability to help a complex adaptive system and a goal-seeking system. It's like selves have to not self in order to be good at selfing. Like, there's a sense in which selves have to have like, and we were kind of earlier talking about like stability and plasticity. It'd be good to dive into that again later in terms of like, in order to be stable, you must also be plastic to degrees. Like, you have to be able to adapt. And so the ability of selves to kind of breathe and move in and out of existence is part of like the preconditions for their existence. But in terms of like the epistemological and ontological claims, one way of like, I guess, of the routes that I've seen, that they seem to get that in Buddhism, sometimes psychedelics, it seems that there is a move that I question its validity, which is epistemologically, when people engage in intense mental training and learn to like focus their attention onto the present moment of experience stably and consistently, you end up getting at something like you discover there's only like Humean bundles, or you end up discovering like all there is just like there's nothing you can point at that you would call like a me, or like there's nothing in your experience that you can and you end up getting a kind of Sam Harris will often talk about this like mysteriousness, like it just things just kind of come out of the darkness and you don't know why
they arise, right? Yeah,
I mean, pure consciousness.
Yeah, but the problem is you stack the deck, like so if part of like the reality of selves is or one of their important realities as real patterns with functional cybernetic significance in terms of their capacity to self-reflect and allow different components of experience to be integrated in a coherent way across time and circumstance. If you just zoom into this one moment of like sensate focus, and then you find like there's no sort of self-reflective, temporally extended process, you can't find it to begin with by virtue of the epistemology, by virtue of the way you. It's a search that cannot have found the self.
Well, I mean, and the interesting thing is,
there never was a self. It was always an illusion. I don't think that follows.
But in some sense, though, this goes again to the phenomenological reduction and the fact that, in order to get past it, we actually do have to make certain assumptions that you can't prove. This is sort of like, Gödel's incompleteness theorem applied to the human system. From within the system that we are, we can never prove that the world exists in differentiated form independently of our experience of it. And yet we all act as if it does. I believe that it does. It's a very useful assumption to make, and I would argue probably true. Right? We just can't prove it from within the confines of our particular experience. So if you don't want to make that assumption, then you do get down to this narrow point where now is all that exists. The present moment is all that exists. And it's even worse than what you're saying, because you don't just dissolve the self. You can get to the point, or better, depending on what kind of experiences you like, but you can discover the prima materia, right? You can discover the undifferentiated, stuff or non-stuff of the universe that's underneath everything, right? You can, and then what's happening is that you are not just dissolving your model of the self, of yourself, you're dissolving your perceptual models as well. Right? There are meditative states that essentially just become like total insensateness, like blackness. Like you could, and it's interesting to think about like what might be happening in there in the brain. Like is the like thalamus shutting down relay of information? I remember reading a Zen in the Brain by James Austin, I think. 20 years ago, and being really impressed by his first very deep like meditative experience coupled with his extensive knowledge of neurology and brain function. And he was trying to figure out like what might be going on in these states. But however it happens, physically, what happens in experience is that you can essentially just stop building any models, and then there's nothing there. There's not you, there's not a world, there's just like some kind of and maybe what's happening is that you can't eliminate every last layer of the model. And so maybe you've still got something that you're describing as, like that sort of core embodied consciousness or whatever you want, however you want to describe it, which is still a modeling process. But, you can get pretty close to shutting it all down. But I think the problem is that instead of realizing that they are getting insight into the way that a human brain works and, the way that this biological system works, people think that they are getting insight into what the universe is external to themselves, and if there's no longer a self, then what is internal and external anyway, right? So I think you can get very ontologically confused.
It's just that case in particular of like advanced meditators, and when they come close to and actually sometimes do like shut the whole process down. Sometimes that's viewed, or it's been suggested, Metzinger moves in that direction in terms Christoph Koch sometimes will, not necessarily appealing so much to advanced meditative states, but 5-MeO-DMT experiences, is actually potentially showing like the I to be illusory also. And I question that also in terms of like, when you like, I guess like, when you dig into those, So the people, when they attain states of advanced meditative absorption, there's these like hallmarks of certain stages that you can get to, where there's reliably observable characteristics of kind of blissful states called the jhanas,
Yeah.
what you can get when they go deep enough into this, and there's a recent study. Matthew Sachet and Brian Toomey have some EEG data that's very interesting. Of you get these things called cessation experiences, and so it's like you're stripping down awareness from like usually so we're doing like this like extended hallucinatory thing where our minds are going in all sorts of different directions to like the present moment, and then like all of a sudden, but then also like your sense of your body starts to fall away, your sense of distinction from between you and world seems far away. I would suggest. I'm somewhat speaking out of school because I'm not a jhana master, but like there always is something of a point of view still, even if it's not. There's always like a view from somewhere, even if you're not like indexing yourself as like a separate agent dualistically. Like there's still like a sense in which there is like a camera from somewhere. There's like with some like locality. Right. But what's interesting for these advanced jhana states is that you push it hard enough, eventually the whole thing shuts down, and it's actually described as a phenomenology of coma or general anesthesia. In terms of in the cessation event, like the duration of time will completely go away, and when they go in to when they go out, there will be no sensation whatsoever. And some of the in terms of like the brain, some of the things we've been observing is like for instance like alpha power just like plummets completely. So it seems like all modeling, you push it hard enough and you get rid of the I, all modeling goes away. But so does all consciousness.
Right. Well, so, that's exactly right. Because what I was thinking as you were describing this is that we need to remember that consciousness itself is a model. And so consciousness basically appears to be I like the phrase that's been used, the remembered present. So we know that consciousness lags about a quarter of a second behind reality. And so you think you're conscious of exactly the moment in which you were acting and being, but in fact, you're conscious of a quarter of a second ago. And that's because it takes some time to assemble all the parts of this complicated model, because you're having to integrate all these different sensory modalities and streams of information into a reasonably coherent model. And so, I think what you described is perfectly consistent with the idea that, like, if you're in that state where all there is blackness, but there's still a perspective, then some part of the model of consciousness is remaining intact. And at its lowest level, it's like some kind of self-awareness, so maybe even there the me is still being created as soon as there's the I. But then if you really manage to shut it all down, there's no consciousness, so there's no time. There's just
it's like being asleep.
You were gone and then you awoke, like you're coming out of anesthesia. And that makes perfect sense to me, because it's like you have shut down consciousness.
It seems like instead of like disproving like the reality of the I, they've actually found the exception that proves the rule. In terms of like, you push it hard enough and you break down the I completely, and then consciousness itself is gone too.
Right. So but right. And there's two ways to look at this. And I'm definitely with you in the sense that I think that when people say that these things are illusory, it usually leads them to less adaptive conclusions, right? Or strategies for dealing with the world. Sometimes, for some people, it then allows them to have, great equanimity and great compassion and all the other good things that, come out of these meditative traditions are aiming at. But I definitely think it can lead people to less than great places. But at the same time, I do think like that means that there is an important sense in which consciousness is an illusion, right? People, again, mistake the model for reality. And so they think that the things that they consciously perceive just are like a transparent window onto reality. Like we've already talked about how like your consciousness of yourself and who you think you are is not a transparent window onto who and what you are. But in the same way, your just basic consciousness of the world around you is not a transparent window onto reality and what's actually there. It is a model that is constructed, and it's, flawed in various ways and limited in various ways. And, it presents this kind of face of seamlessness or smoothness. But one of the things that you can learn through meditation is how to actually see the the cracks in that, and how to catch like the fact that it actually does dissolve around the edges, and it's not like as temporally smooth as you kind of naively perceive it as being, and all these things. So there are certainly illusory aspects of consciousness, just as there are illusory aspects of the self, but neither is an illusion in terms of their existence. Like consciousness is something that exists, and the self is something that exists. It's just a model rather than a, conduit to reality.
There's also something there that like consciousness is the thing that we point to things as real or illusory from, in some sense. Like it's the basis of our judgments for what's real and what's illusory. So there's a level where I like Merleau-Ponty's idea that we always point to illusions from some ground of reality. Like you say one thing is an illusion, it means something else is real. So like if you say the self is an illusion, what's the reality? In some sense, then there's no I, there's no consciousness. I mean, where does that really leave us to judge things as real or illusory at all? If that
it's
makes
certainly
sense.
A challenge, but I mean, one thing we can do is take a third person ontology and say that there are things that the organism does without consciousness. So, for example, like Jeffrey Gray, like this example that when you're playing tennis, you may think that you are consciously deciding, how to run to hit the ball after your opponent strikes it, but you're not. Consciousness is not really involved in that, except it's playing catch up. And the reason for that is that the game, when it's played at a competent level, is simply too fast for consciousness. You don't have a quarter of a second to wait around and figure out like where's that ball going. You have to be moving to where that ball is going. Probably even before the racket has actually hit the ball on your opponent's side. And so we know essentially that as goal-directed agents, we don't need consciousness for everything that we do.
And that we probably shouldn't have it for everything because it interferes with a lot of stuff that we're doing.
It's a classic experience in sports where if you've got some really well routinized and skilled routine and you start thinking about it too much consciously, you end up interfering. And I think that because consciousness is essentially a top-down controller and programmer. And so the reason that you have consciousness is so that you can better guide your attention, so that you can better control these low-level cybernetic systems that are acting without consciousness. What you want is to sort of, minimize the need for consciousness in terms of directing your actions, but you need consciousness in order to be effective at doing that, and in troubleshooting and in future planning and all these things where you're going to determine how the systems run off when they encounter the right things in the world, but they don't need consciousness to run off and to act.
And I want to say, like, sorry, Adam, is part of that habitual unconscious self, is that part of the self? Because I mean, if the I is just pure consciousness, like why would the lower level habitual controllers not be representative of the self in some way? Because consciousness has like trained those parts, and it's trained them, it's responsible for them in some sense.
All depends on what you mean by the word self, right? We can take we can take Jung's definition of the self, which is totally different from most psychological uses of self, and say that the self is essentially the totality of the organism and its potentialities, right? And then, so then everything's part of the self. And the thing is, except in these kinds of attempts to be philosophically rigorous about what words mean, people use language in all kinds of sloppy and changing ways. And so somebody might be like, well, of course that's part of the self. But in fact, the reason that's part of the self when you say that is that you have just started adding it into your model of what you are, right? And therefore, you're not directly perceiving the controllers, you're now creating a model of those controllers. Okay, so now it's part of the self, but the self remains that model that you have, which is conscious and which you can talk about. So that's the reason why I would say you shouldn't include those low-level unconscious controllers as part of the self, because I want to define the self as the model that we create consciously to understand ourselves. And so, but again, like, I can think of reasons why that's tricky, because what if we want to say, like, this person unconsciously has low self-esteem? well, what the heck does that mean if the self is by definition conscious, right? We might say that there are modes of evaluation of what we are that don't rely on consciousness, right? So maybe the self isn't necessarily a conscious model. Maybe it is a model that can be emotional even when it's not been fully integrated into consciousness, right? Because self-esteem is fundamentally an emotional evaluation of ourselves.
There does seem to be something like special about, I guess, explicit beliefs or conscious beliefs in selfhood. But yeah, I guess so it's good like we're not conscious of all the things because things would not be manageable. It's like it's good that there's like a very, I want to say like a rich system one, the system two can ride on top of, or like come back to Heidegger, like the ready to hand versus present at hand. You're like in the world in a state of unconscious mastery of the contingencies around you, just kind of just getting it done. And then it's only when like the hammer slips and you hit your thumb, then all of a sudden you go from like ready at hand to present to hand. And then you have this like onerous thing of self-consciousness is coming in to help you manage it. But it's, I guess the unconscious elements, while they do seem to be, I guess like less essential to selfhood, there's a sense in which they're also sometimes like more important in terms of something like character or like habits, the ways like, for instance, like the scope of selfhood and the scope of agency, it can potentially be like really you want to like have a whole bunch of well-honed characteristic adaptations and also looks like good habits. Like in, I guess I'm kind of thinking like in like the Confucian tradition, like the model is one like over time you're trying to cultivate yourself so that what you do automatically is just the right thing.
Right.
That your impulse is the right thing. So I guess
I think when we say that, we're using a more Jungian notion of self, right? Because then if you say like train yourself so that even your automatic habits are the one, are the right ones, the desirable ones, then you're talking about self as the entire organism. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that
elephant and rider, and like have it get like a well-trained elephant.
Yeah,
like you're.
Usually, when psychology talks about the self, they're talking about the rider. But often, when we talk about the self, we're talking about the whole package. And so, yeah, those things are obviously crucially important. And I think again, this goes back to the reasons that consciousness isn't as important as people think it is. I mean, obviously it's incredibly important, right? But it is a small portion of the total information processing that your brain is doing, right? It's doing all of this stuff that allows you to perceive and act effectively in the world. Oh, and then it's also building this integrated model at about a quarter-second delay that is like allowing it to direct attention to parts of the world that need more information processing, more in-depth information processing, generally because some kind of prediction has failed, right? You've got constant failures of prediction as well as successful prediction. And consciousness is basically tracking those and checking, like, do we need to change something? Do we need to consider a different way of thinking or planning?
So there's like both the structure and the functional characteristics of selfhood cybernetically, and there's, I guess, the claims about well-being relating to modifying the self in different ways. And so it seems like, for instance, like you mentioned, like equanimity or potentially like an on-ramp to compassion, like or like helping with plasticity, getting unstuck. So it's like there's a way, like these narratives that, like, I guess are like we are like narratives that are attaining degrees of truth with the telling / enacting, but like we can also like get owned by ourselves and trapped in our own narrative. And so it's good to be able to like relax the narrative. So it's like this seems like a good move to have available to you, something like mindfulness, something like being able to like as a fairly neurotic person, being able to like dwell in the present moment of experience, like give yourself like a freaking break from time to time. That seems like a good move. Maybe if you have like access to like these like pleasurable jhana states, like maybe that's like another good way of like giving yourself like a mini vacation, or like helping to like they sometimes describe it as like it's like it helps with your meditation because like it makes it feel good to do it and you want to do it. So it's like Like it helps with focusing the mind. So there's all sorts of helpful things you can get from this. But I guess the thing I worry about is the potential, like both flirting with nihilism or something like pleasure divorced from meaning, in terms of like if you have access to like a kind of wireheading or like a lotus eating or experience, like you have access to some a good way of being, but it doesn't involve you achieving any valued goals in the world or coordinating with anyone in any kind of meaningful way necessarily. It's usually suggested though that like there is like a built-in ethics, and that when you realize that you're not different from anyone else, you're automatically having like an on-ramp to compassion and like including others in this kind of like like this, we're all one intersubjective value of each other.
Right.
I think that that is definitely like a thing, like maybe, I don't know, like say like it's like the wisdom and beauty of like Cloud Atlas or something like that. Great movie. But like I also though sometimes wonder where it's like I don't know, like that is one way of caring for others, is seeing the ways you're not different from them. But another way of like being other including is like you consider like their uniqueness and everything that's like compelling and special about that person. And it's like I sometimes wonder like whether it's a kind of like thin and potentially even somewhat dehumanizing form of compassion if the way you get there is you say, well, I'm an illusion, you're an illusion, we're all the same illusion. It's like, I guess that's a
Right.
kind of,
I think
but I
that
don't
it's optimistic. It's optimistic to think that that always has a good outcome, right?
Yeah, it doesn't
I
sound
don't know what the literature is on it, because I've seen mixed
that
things on like
positive.
personality and outcomes, things like, you know, like effects on like latent narcissism and stuff, like the fruits of meditation. It does seem to be very beneficial for some people, but
Right.
it hasn't been clear to me that like on net the results for personality are beneficial. Like in terms of like the ways it's beneficial, like some of what you've written in like your like the recent article you wrote on like well-being, and like ways like mindfulness can basically help you to achieve integration and help with it. Like that, it seems like in theory that should be the case. But the thing I don't know about is empirically the case that people who go deep on deconstructing themselves, do they actually come out ahead? Because I have to say, like, I sometimes have encountered places where it's like, you might feel great to be in your like beatific flow state, but that doesn't mean you're a good person.
Right.
Like
Right.
something like conscience might require you to like actually represent yourself in a way as like and self-reflect, like, wait, how did I show up in this circumstance? Like among like, what's it like for this, like actually like losing,
As
like
opposed to being like,
taking
there is no me anyway, so why would I even
Yeah.
worry about that?
I feel
like you
fantastic.
might be feeling great, but that doesn't mean you're having a great impact on the world, you know, like
Sure.
so.
Yeah. I mean, I have a similar kind of anecdotal perspective on that, which is that sometimes it leads to good outcomes. Sometimes it leads to what seem like not so good outcomes. And
Yeah.
it seems logical to me that that would be the case, right? That getting into that kind of, you know, breakdown of modeling could lead to more flexibility, less self-centeredness, more compassion, or it could lead to something that was more like irresponsibility and a sort of profound self-centeredness, despite the fact that there is no longer believed to be a self.
It seems like we're kind of tiptoeing around self-transcendence here a lot in terms of this weird puzzle, like that we can become different selves. You can be like my old self. This is who, but then there has to be some sort of continuity between that. It's like a Theseus's ship kind of problem. Like if I strip out all the modeling, am I still the same, ship or the same conscious agent? And like, how do you account for transformations of self? Maybe Colin within
I think
the
that
framework.
once we were talking about the me self, the self as the model, then it's quite easy to see why you could have a different self, and in as much as it's not like consciousness is only modeling things and not having a causal effect. In fact, the reason that you have that modeling process is in order to do more complex control over what's going on. It's just not at the scale that we perceive it to be, right? The illusion is that consciousness is controlling everything that we do from moment to moment, but it's certainly contributing to the control of what we do over more extended periods of time. And so you can develop a new self, and that can be both the model and can also then translate into the actual patterns of behavior. But I think the way there's continuity is just that it's the same physical organism with the same, skin boundary over time. And it's like this is a physical system. It transacts with the physical universe around it, but it also has this kind of defended boundary and autopoietic quality in which it, continuously builds and repairs itself. So that discreteness of the entity as a physical entity persists over time. Even if, you might go through some crazy meditation or drug experience or whatever and feel like you just, I'm a totally new person now. I do different things. I like different things. I think about everything, including myself, totally differently. Totally legitimate to say that, you have transcended the old self, you're a new self, but you're the same organism.
In terms of things that additional sources of stability across time and things that hold fast, I guess I'm thinking of like goal hierarchies and conscientiousness potentially as being, like clearly values do change over time with different life experiences, but there's like a sense where like if they go beyond some bounds, you'd say like that person is no longer themselves. Like it's like there's a certain stage where it's like someone like they're suffering from like someone has like frontal temporal dementia. It's like the memories start to go, but if like the values are holding, you're more or less like the rank and order of values are kind of like the way they prioritize things. They're conscientious, the way it shows up. It's like, yep, still them. But then there's once like the values, like the deep values are no longer like reigning, and then you're like, I don't know who that person is anymore. It's like they're right. And so I guess I'm wondering in terms of there is no like essential self that's permanent. Like, and clearly, like, I don't have the same values now that I did when I was like 5 years old. Even there's like an initial, like my inner lamprey, mammal thing had this initial utility function of like, I like the certain feels and the warmth. But then like I elaborated that, but there's a certain point where like it kind of congealed. And then you start to say like, okay, there was like a persisting character, a persisting me. And then if that's lost through like life experience, like I'm thrust into like some sort of war zone or something that like my personality breaks or just like the ravages of time or like something, then like there does seem to be like even though there is no unchanging essence, there is kind of like a center of valuing mass when it congeals at a certain point where if that's lost, it does seem like we would say that something essential is lost. Something very
that's really what I'm that's what I'm getting at, I think.
I like the way that you frame that because you put values so centrally, right? And values are persistent goals, often relatively high level goals. And I think that what that highlights is that the goal hierarchy, the value hierarchy, is the core of the self. It is what the model is most fundamentally. When we think about who you are, you can say a bunch of things, but what, if you interrogate it well enough, you get to the things that you value are the things that are most core to the self. And the more you value them, the more deep the values are, the more core they are to the self. And that explains why I think we have this experience that you're saying where, the less important stuff, even the less important values can shift and we still maintain a sense of the person as the same self persisting. But if some of those really core values start to change and they are just pursuing totally different aims fundamentally, then we lose the sense of continuity. I mean, in some sense, this is it's sort of an obvious claim about personality, right? Which is that personality by definition is what is persistent for the person, what allows us to predict what they're going to be like, what they're going to do. And so, if somebody has brain damage and their personality changes, we detect that, right? It's like this person doesn't behave in the same ways that they did before.
Gauge was no longer gauge.
Exactly. Gauge is no longer gauge. But when we talk about that in the language of the self, then I do think that really makes values more core to that because, well, and I also think that just highlights how intertwined all aspects of personality are with value and goal directedness, right? It's like your style of pursuing your goals and what those goals are is fundamentally your personality.
I'm nearly thinking like, and this is kind of a crazy idea, but like if you could like make a person completely transparent, but you were trying to look at their self in some sense, like see completely through them, like it would just be that goal hierarchy, like illuminated in some sense of like, that's the thing that if I pick that person out, I'm like, that's you, like that's the way you normally do stuff. That's the invariant kind of behaviors are rooted in that value hierarchy.
Yeah, although I do want to then complicate things a little, at least a little, by going back to the fact that we have this different meanings of the word self. Because when we're talking about the way that a psychologist would usually think about, like, let's, assess the self or whatever, you're going to be getting at the person's beliefs about their goal hierarchy. But your beliefs about what your goal hierarchy looks like is not identical to what your goal hierarchy looks like. Right, so if you could really see through, let's make the person transparent, we'll do it with this visual metaphor, you're going to see a goal hierarchy, and then you're going to see a model of a goal hierarchy, and you're going to be able to see where they are or are not congruent, right? And this is
oftentimes like self-serving model of the goal hierarchy.
Right. This is a therapeutic tool metaphorically, right? It's like the therapist wants to understand not only what the person thinks of themselves and think that they value, but also what they really value in ways that may contradict what they tell you and what they believe about themselves.
Intention behavior gap in like a lot of the social media literature as well. That's why a lot of it's very effective, obviously, because it can just build a model without this kind of the person's beliefs about themselves interfere. Like it can offer you up stuff that you're not even aware that you're actually going to be very tempted by in some sense, because it's outside of your modeling of yourself.
Right. Well, I mean, the funny thing is that even a personality questionnaire can get information about people that they don't know about themselves, even though the way that you get the information is to ask them explicitly about their beliefs about themselves. But merely aggregating that into patterns sometimes produces an insight that people have not yet realized about themselves. It's like, oh, I didn't realize there was a connection between all of these different things about myself. It's one of the funny things that you get when people start studying personality psychology for the first time is that people often sort of think that these personality tests are magic in some way. It's like you ask all these questions and then you deduce this amazing stuff. And it's like, no, you just told me what you're like. So that's all I've got to go on. And like sometimes the personality tests aren't accurate because you're too wrong about what you're like.
You don't know yourself.
When you discover these elements of yourself that are not necessarily ones you would self-endorse, not are egocentric, or like, for instance, like, or maybe they are like for instance, like, so that like there's this discrepancy between like, okay, so I'm gonna give you like, here's who I think I am, and then like here's like the revealed preferences, and like what my values like would be if you just like observed my behavior or queried me like across all these circumstances. Like, oh, that is not what I said when you just asked me to narratize, to summarize myself. And it seems like, so usually it would be the case. It's like, well, no, the thing I said before, that's like the thing I really value, and the other thing is like that's where like the work I have to do of like closing that gap. I guess I'm wondering, are there cases where it's like maybe it's like, I don't know, you come to realize like maybe the thing I said wasn't right, and actually like if you look at like the bulk of these things, there was like a wisdom in like the revealed preference, even though it wasn't initially like egocentric, like you update your ego. I don't know, like is it the case that it's like the you that talks and thinks it understands itself, like by fiat it is correct, or is it like sometimes actually not just like confused because it's not following the plot of you, but actually there might be a wisdom to the unconscious self that isn't there in the conscious self or the self-reflective self?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, sometimes, Rogers used to talk about the organism and the whole organismic valuing process, right? And that sometimes the organism knows better than the self. And so, yeah, why couldn't you have values and things that actually would be like that? If you managed to recognize that you had them and then integrate it into your conscious model of yourself, you would be better off. And not just because you're more integrated, but also because like what you see you see this all the time in the context of teaching and mentoring undergrads. It's like you've got somebody, they come in and I guess, like the classic trajectory is like, I'm going to be pre-med, it's like either I've always wanted to help people or, my parents thought this was like the right path. And so So you're pre-med and you're very attached to that, but you may discover that this isn't really very suitable to you, and maybe you want to go and be a musician or something, just to use a dramatic example. There are all kinds of ways in which people can end up confused about what values are most appropriate for who they are as unique individuals.
There's a Nietzsche quote I'm going to send you both, which I've already sent to you, but I think.
Well, you should probably read it for our audience.
Do you want to read it out?
Yeah, I'll read it out. It's Schopenhauer's Educator, Untimely Meditations. But how can we find ourselves again? How can man know himself? He is a thing dark and veiled. And if the hair has 7 skins, man can slough off 70 times 7 and still not be able to say, this is really you. This is no longer outer shell. Moreover, it is a painful and dangerous undertaking, thus, to tunnel into oneself and to force one's way down into the shaft of one's being by the nearest path. A man who does it can easily so hurt himself that no physician can cure him. And moreover, again, what need should there be for it, since everything bears witness to what we are? Our friendships and our enmities, our glance and the clasp of our hand, our memory and that which we do not remember, our books and our handwriting. This, however, is the means by which an inquiry into the most important aspect can be initiated. Let the youthful soul look back on life with the question, what have you truly loved up to now? What has drawn your soul aloft? What has mastered it and at the same time blessed it? Set up these revered objects before you, and perhaps their nature and their sequence will give you a law, the fundamental law of your own true self. Compare these objects with one another and see how one completes, expands, surpasses, transfigures another, how they constitute a stepladder upon which you have clambered up to yourself as you are now. For your true nature lies not concealed deep within you, but immeasurably high above you, or at least above that which you usually take yourself to be. Your true educators and formative teachers reveal to you that the true original meaning and basic stuff of your nature is something completely incapable of being educated or formed, and is in any case something difficult of access, bound and paralyzed. Your educators can only be your liberators. And that is the secret of all culture. It does not provide artificial limbs, wax noses, or spectacles. That which can provide these things is rather only sham education. We're almost done. Culture is liberation, the removal of all the weeds, rubble, and vermin that want to attack the tender buds of the plant, and outstreaming of light and warmth, the gentle rustling of nocturnal rain. It is imitation and worship of nature, where nature is in her motherly and merciful mood. It is the perfecting of nature when it deflects her cruel and merciless assaults and turns them to good, and when it draws a veil over the expression of nature's stepmotherly mood and her sad lack of understanding.
You said a quote. I think you meant a chapter.
Yes, I did.
Sounds like he's doing personality psychology in parts of that.
No, there's lots of good stuff in there, right? I mean, Nietzsche was a very psychological philosopher, obviously, which is why psychologists kind of like him.
The thing I'm wondering about is, like, in your well-being chapter and in other places, like also in the original, like CBT5T, like you talk about integration. And I guess one thing I'm wondering is, like, notions of Jungian integration and like senses where it's like, I guess to what extent can we be said to like there is no answer, like rather the answer of like to what extent we have selves is actually partially a function of how we're doing in our project of attempting to be integrated, where it's like achieving an integrated character is a kind of part of being more of a self, like as opposed to being like legion. Right. It's good to be large and contain multitudes, but like if the multitudes aren't coherence.
Well, right. That's how Jung used self, like with a capital S, right? That it was the potential for that integration and for the totality to be in the driver's seat, let's say. But I also think if we think more about the me self and the way that we more commonly use that in psychology, that the more full of conflict and confused your goal hierarchy is, the harder it's going to be to tell a coherent story about who you are and what you want and what you value, right? And so the actual coherence and integration of your motivational systems is likely to be reflected in the coherence versus confusion of yourself as a model.
And is the process of aligning that, is that like the kind of, what was coming up as well while you were reading the quote, Adam, was know thyself. Like, because that seems, it on one level, I don't think it's just knowledge. It's almost like a Jungian kind of recovering of the unconscious. Like, it seemed to be going down these levels. I don't know if you know that Jung had a dream once where he's in like an 18th century house, and then he goes down a level and it's like a medieval castle, and then below that it's like Roman, and then finally it's like a cave. He looked at it as like going down the levels of his own psyche, in a sense. He's like, if you go down far enough through yourself, you're going to reach all the layers of culture, all the layers of biology, and in some sense have to travel through them and integrate them into the self. So it's like, is that the kind of process of your confused, conflicted self, that you're reordering it in some sense through this kind of educational journey, maybe?
So, when Jung talked about this, he talked about it in terms of archetypes and the collective unconscious. But I think if we take a more perspective on it that's slightly more compatible with modern science, but nonetheless retains these insights, we get to the idea that the going down these levels, you are getting down into these potentialities for human experience, reaction, emotion, motivation, that are pretty much universal to human nature, and therefore everybody has the capacity for them, but people may not have actually encountered them yet in their lives. And or they may be essentially alienated from them in consciousness, right? So trying to think of a good example. Let's say somebody who thinks of themselves as very self-reliant, and as really not needing deep connections with other people, and has never really developed deep connections with other people. But that doesn't mean that person doesn't have the capacity for deep connection, and B, wouldn't necessarily benefit from that deep connection, even if they don't believe that they would, or that they don't believe that it would be useful for them. And I would think of that like having some kind of experience of that, the capacity for that's totally different than what you've experienced so far and than what you think you value, would be like getting in touch with some aspect of the collective unconscious, right? It's like and if that's represented and symbolically and metaphorically, because that's precisely how we tend to represent things that we don't have a good rational understanding of yet. We represent them metaphorically through symbols, through analogies. That's how, anyway, I would reconcile Jung's take on that with something that works for the way that I think about how the brain works and how people work.
And but that's like a real potentiality that person, say, who has never experienced deep connection, but has a potentiality for it, but I don't know, is that learning to know thyself? Would that not be more like getting in touch with something, like why they don't have a want of a deep connection or something like that, something in their own history, something in their own genetics?
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that all part of understanding yourself better? It's like first of all, you understand that you do have the capacity for this thing. Maybe you even come to understand that at some level you desire it, which is to say that it is a goal that your system is tracking and it has registered as unfulfilled. And all this, again, like all these, most of these cybernetic processes are not necessarily entering into consciousness, but you can still be tracking whether things meet your, essentially aims or not. And so there may be some deep level at which you are unfulfilled, but you've been actually very good at deprioritizing that relative to other goals. But because it's such a deep, basic goal, it's part of human nature, you aren't able to completely extinguish it. And so you might learn that you actually have a goal where you didn't think you had one. You might learn that you could prioritize it more and it wouldn't like screw up everything else about your life and what you care about. You might learn, as you say, about what might be the reasons in your history and your experience that you did deprioritize it so thoroughly. So all of that I would think of as very compatible with the idea of knowing yourself better.
I'm thinking like it would call to you attentionally in some sense as well. Like Jung had that idea of like your future self calling to you through your attention. Like in some sense, you're hyper work focused or something like that, but some people having a good time catches your eye and you're like, oh, I'm kind of focused on this, but like these other needs in the goal hierarchy are still present in some sense and call you forth on this journey in order to integrate that part of your that underlying goal, or to complete it maybe, that's been ignored, but is still exerting a selection pressure unconsciously. Does that make sense?
I think that's an excellent point, right? Because in cybernetics, we tend to define goal more broadly than than psychologists typically do. Like to a psychologist, a goal is often something where you've got a very concrete vision of what you want, and you are committed to working toward it. But I think it's much more useful to realize that, I mean, that's an important category of goals, obviously, but the category of goal is broader, and that there are things that we, at least at some level, would desire the future to be like, but we've deprioritized them so thoroughly that they're not guiding our actions. But what you're pointing out is that that doesn't mean that they're not still guiding our attention and our perception. So there are things that might, here's a trivial example. I've always kind of wished I could play music and, some musical instrument. And when I was in high school, I got a guitar, and, the standard, here's your acoustic guitar. Now you can be a boy in high school. And I took a few lessons and tried to pick it up. And then I worked on it some more when I was in college, and, could bang through a couple of songs, but not well. And I just didn't have a particular aptitude for it. And so, I haven't tried to learn how to play music in many, many years, but it's obviously still influencing the way that I interpret and react to the world around me. The fact that I would like it if I could do that, even though it's not a goal in the sense of a currently active goal that is influencing my behavior in any way. It shapes my interpretations still.
It's, I guess, like the thing I like about the Nietzsche quote is there still seems to be like in terms of like guiding, like how would you know in terms of like, is this like is the future self calling itself to like manifest through you, through your attention in the present? Like to what degree is that like a victor's history in terms of like that's what will manifest, like that's the future self that will be, but is that the one actually you wanted? Like I'm thinking maybe also of like Laurie Paul's like transformative experiences, where it's like something happens, is like, you get into it, your attention went there, but like if you played that game out, like would you have actually signed up for that? And so like in the Nietzsche quote, he's sort of like saying like trying to find like a deep like a dominating coalition of value from across your life, some sort of like harmonic across all of that, some sort of like. So I guess the thing I'm wondering is like, so your attention is being called, and that will be, I guess, very likely to be part of like your future bringing itself into being via the present. But is that actually the future you that you want? It'll relate to some kind of need, or not need, but some desire. So there's something like, but like, it seems quite fraught, like it's like, I guess wherever my attention's going, like this is where I've got
to go. It's optimistic because it's like, does the fact that I still am sort of caught by the possibility of being good on a musical instrument mean that I will be one day? I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but it doesn't seem that likely to me.
And you think of like an addiction or something that captures attention. That's
right,
like,
exactly. And there are all kinds of negative things capture your attention too. And those might reflect real underlying drives or motivations that you either do or don't know that you have. But it's not at all clear that you just want to let everything that pops up as a motivation somehow be part of yourself, right? And what's actually guiding you. So, there's a lot of work of picking and choosing to do, I think. And, the other thing in that Nietzsche quote was that this process can be destructive. If you start to try to really like drill down and question everything, you may end up like taking yourself apart and having trouble putting yourself back together again.
You may not come back together in the way you
right.
hope.
Same thing as what you're talking about with these like extreme, either diving into meditative traditions or into psychedelics. Like all of these are ways to make everything more flexible, to take it apart again. And then the hope and the therapeutic potential is that it can come back together in more adaptive ways and more well integrated ways, but it doesn't always work out that way. But it still seems like the key is this idea of integration, which is that you need a well organized and non-conflicting goal hierarchy. there are always going to be some goals that are in a bit of conflict with each other, and you're always going to have, say, some impulses that you might not want to totally indulge. But the hope is that the ones that you don't want to have in so much control end up getting lower down and less priority, and the ones that are most important end up not totally conflicting with each other. You're trying to basically build a system that can pursue a whole wide variety of goals, some of which are innate and some of which are acquired, without totally undermining itself and conflicting with itself.
I like that we're focusing this conversation on people, because people exist, and I know this is going to be relevant to, this is useful for us regardless of what we're in. But it's interesting, thinking these things as they apply to people's concerns and hopes about AI, and things like the functions of AI can achieve, and also alignability. What does alignment mean? And it's so there's a sense in which what you're hoping for is for the system to have something like a self, and something like a ruling coalition of value that will be stable across time and circumstance, and it will will need to have some give to it, but not too much. Some things will hold fast across circumstance, and it will not stray from certain values.
Right. No, that's fascinating. But I think part of the problem is, and part of the challenge is that we don't actually want the AI to be like a person too much, because a person is very good at breaking out of constraints and choosing their own goals. Not everybody is, but that's certainly a potentiality. And so we want to have some part of the self that we can just ensure is fixed in that AI, in that robot. And I don't know how easy that's going to be to achieve.
There was the Claude thing as well with the when they gave it. I don't know if you heard about this experiment that they did. They were threatening to do all these awful things to it essentially, and then they'd provided it information or access to one of the researchers' emails where they'd faked an affair in it, in the emails, and then basically when Claude was pushed, it was I'll tell everybody about your affair if you do this thing.
And this was consistent and across several of the different, main AI models. Basically, the AI would resort to various forms of blackmail and threats and manipulation to try to prevent being blocked from some of its core trained goals.
So some people suggest you can get I don't know. So there's people who are saying don't build a system that's person-like at all. Don't veer into agency. But there's other proposals I've seen of interesting contemplative wisdom for superalignment, suggesting if you can create a Buddhist AI, that's the way to go. But I guess one thing I'm wondering is if you don't, even though there's these dangers associated with people, can you actually get a sufficiently intelligent autonomous system that can navigate a world of other autonomous systems that are human-like and understand them and have the right kinds of common sense and ability to be aligned with us, if the system itself is not enough like us in terms of its doesn't have this common ground to draw from? And I guess so one question I'm wondering is can you get the kinds of agents and assistants and AIs that do all the things you want without that? And then, but yeah, there's certainly the danger time. But then if that's the case that you are forced, so one, what kind of alignment dangers happen from a selfless AI? Or if we're committed to selves, because that's what's going to allow it to do science and help us in all sorts of ways, be tutors for children and good doctors, all the things. I guess was it John Vervaeke? He talks about loving up AI. Is there a sense where it's optimal self-construction, create the most integrated, benevolent self for these systems? That's a goal to strive for.
Yeah.
Something.
But I think the thing that you mentioned something that I think explains why that isn't possible, or at least, it may be possible to some extent, but why it's never going to be foolproof, which is simply different physical needs, different core features of the nature of the system. One of the things that people are worried about is biological warfare by AIs. And so if a super AI decides that people are inconvenient, why not just wipe us all out? Well, we know why people don't do that, because if if somebody tries to wipe everybody out, they're going to wipe themselves out too, right? Exactly. And so I don't know how you get around the fact that there can be just fundamental misalignments based on physical nature. And if you get, you say create an AI without a self, if you make it sophisticated enough in its modeling capacity, of course it's going to model itself. And if a self is fundamentally just a model of, the thing, then of course it's going to model itself. So I don't, good luck on having a non-self AI.
One thing, I mean, this is, we're definitely in like sci-fi territory here, but I guess like in terms of like, so let's say you had some kind of like humanoid robot, and there's some sort of condition of common, at least you're not getting all the things the same, because it's not like eating and excreting and doing all the things. But if there's like enough of like a common embodiment and some like shared interests and shared vulnerability, from that can you get like basically empathy, as like if you bake in like empathy hard enough for like a certain like phase of developing the system, can you get something like a value core, where like a self-stabilizing value regime that would hold across circumstance, if you just like get the belief, both like explicitly and implicitly from enough experience, like it is good to be good to others, and like you get more of what you want. Like
right,
right,
like, and a belief about a belief about what's good is a goal, it's a value. So I don't see why not in principle, because it would involve just making sure that some of those altruistic goals were sufficiently deeply instantiated in the system. But that certainly has nothing to do with the way that current AIs are being trained, in which they are trained fundamentally to, pursue certain tasks effectively, and then the attempts at altruism are like a little bit of, frosting brushed over the top. And these experiments that Mohan was talking about are, essentially proving how shallow that alignment training is. Because as soon as you put those more shallowly trained values in conflict with the more deeply trained values, the more deeply trained values win. So could you do it differently? Probably. But it's hard to see how we get there from where we are now. And it's hard to see how you ever deprioritize self-preservation sufficiently that it would not necessarily override other goals that you would much prefer the system to have.
How do we do it? Yeah. How do you convince people to overcome their self-preservation for the common good?
I wasn't even thinking about
not
people.
often.
I mean, the interesting thing is people can do that sometimes, right? People go on principled hunger strikes, and
parents do it for their children all the time, like in terms of like there's like it is accomplished. People do die for causes.
Yeah, and it's usually for altruistic purposes. But so how do we build that into an AI?
Yeah, it seems like the present, I guess, so the question is like, so, is it relevant given the present approaches? But the other question is like, in a couple of years, what will be relevant for where people are at? Some people would suggest that like, they continue to scale quite well, showing, new performance, especially with like the inference time compute. But then other people are arguing that like, we need like fundamentally new paradigms, that they are like potentially going to run out of steam. And because their symbols aren't grounded, they're not like, they're still going to, in a way, get like wrecked by the frame problem if you try to make them an autonomous system, like that, like, not relevant now with what people are doing in the current like arms race among like businesses and nations. But if like the people who would say that the current paradigm can only go so far, maybe even because they lack something like coherent selfhood, and so they never achieve like long range coherence of the kind we want. Like, so, but then the question is like, to try to do the recapitulating human personhood thing, well, that's a very big lift. Like, how long would that one take us? That's I don't know if that's something like any of us will live to see. But you need like,
would the business
like,
interests kind of would business interests align with that as well? If you're going to give them like a functioning goal hierarchy to solve the frame problem, it's like they might not be useful tools in that sense. They'll be going around like trying to figure themselves out or get a meal or something, like what would they be very useful things if we made themselves in that sense?
Well,
Probably
maybe we
going
should
over
call
time
it
here though
there.
as well. Yeah, I was gonna say I was actually gonna save the AI selfhood for our next chat at some point, but we Adam opened the door, so we had to walk through it. Like,
That's right. We got a bonus 15 minutes.
got a bonus one. Thank you very much, gentlemen. This was brilliant. Really great stuff. It's eased my self anxiety a little bit.
What kind of self anxiety did you have?
Which one? The me's, I think. But thank you both very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. A lot of fun.